Welcome to the Tepper School of Business Multimedia Series. For more information on the Tepper School at Carnegie Mellon, please visit us at www.tepper.cmu.edu/multimedia. And now, here's your selected video.
Well, I think that what makes vouchers an interesting area of research is that they continue to be an appropriate answer to the problems of public education. And also, I think that vouchers have a variety of effects that are not particularly highlighted during the political debate. Vouchers are a very controversial policy, but the policy debate does not always engage the complexities of the design and effects of a voucher program. And that's exactly where researchers can make a contribution. The idea behind universal vouchers is that any household in a metropolitan area is eligible for a voucher that they can take to a private school. So this is definitely a large-scale voucher program. We are talking about any family in a metropolitan area being eligible for a voucher. We actually have not seen this kind of voucher programs implemented in the United States. So what I'm going to talk about is the potential effects of these vouchers. And so of course, the specifics of the effects depend on the dollar amount of the voucher, but in general, what we can say is that, first of all, universal vouchers have an effect on school choices. People would use these vouchers, if they were available, to enroll in private schools. So enrollment in private schools would definitely rise. Also, new private schools would enter the market as a consequence of the existence of vouchers, both non-sectarian and religious schools. And something else that is also very interesting is that currently people choose where to live partly based on the quality of the public schools. So many people choose to live in suburbs where housing is relatively expensive and property tax rates are high and send their kids to good public schools. However, if private school vouchers were available, many of those people might actually move back to the city where they can access less expensive houses, pay less in property taxes, and use the voucher to attend private schools. In other words, vouchers will have the ability to break this connection between where people live and where they send the children to school. And this would definitely benefit the city because it would bring a number of middle and perhaps high-income families back to the city. It would clearly change the residential and demographic face of the city as well. Also, as people relocate, obviously, there would be some interesting effects on the real estate market because many houses their prices would definitely drop. This is typically suburban houses because suburbanists are trying to move out of there, whereas urban housing prices would rise. And this, in turn, would actually favor the finances of the public schools in the city. And the reason for that is that property values would rise, which means the property tax revenues would rise. So now public schools in the cities would have a higher revenue per child and fewer students, and that clearly would help public schools in the city, which is perhaps not an effect that people would expect at the beginning. It is usually argued by voucher opponents that, as you said, vouchers would deprive public schools of much needed money. That's not entirely true. Public schools are funded partly by the state and partly by the district. The state portion of the funding is something that is available to the schools only to the extent that they have students. So if the student leaves, the money leaves as well. If the student had not been there in the first place, the money would not have been there in the first place either. So to a certain extent, one should not worry about the loss of the state portion of the funding. What's interesting, however, is that the property tax revenue is available to the public school regardless of whether the child is enrolled in public school or not, because the district raises it anyways. Furthermore, private school families also pay property taxes and to a certain extent subsidize public school families by paying property taxes. And so, if now we have suburbanites moving into the city, bidding up property values in the city, and we have fewer kids attending public schools in the city, we end up having more property tax revenue per child in the city. And this clearly helps the urban public schools' finances. So there are two basic implications that I would like to mention, and one of them is that depending on the voucher amount, most households in any given metropolitan area would actually benefit from vouchers. But in particular, the households that would attain the largest gains are households below the median income level, which are also the households that most need this educational reform. They are the ones who are in the greatest need of school reform, and they are definitely the ones that would benefit the most. And they would benefit because of two things. On the one hand, because they would have more options as to which school to attend, and also because they would be able to choose the classroom environment that they want for their children. And so this combination of being able to choose the type of education that they want and the kind of classroom environment that they want would definitely play in their favor. So that's one thing that I would want to say. The other thing is, I think it's also important from the point of view of those interested in improving public education. I think it is important to see the success of vouchers and the fact that people would take up the voucher and go to private schools. I think it's important for the public school establishment to be able to say, okay, when the voucher becomes available, people use it. Namely, there is something that private education provides and that people want. Can we offer that as well? Or can we offer a substitute for that that parents might be interested in as well? I think that's probably the greatest thing that vouchers can do for public education, spur greater improvement. The fundamental tool that is used in this research is something that has a very fancy name called a general equilibrium model. And the idea is very simple. Because residential choice and school choice are connected, anything that affects school choice by affecting a large number of people will also affect residential choice, housing prices, the revenue of the public school systems, and so forth. In other words, any large-scale voucher program will also affect markets besides the education market. And to be able to take those different markets into account, we use something called general equilibrium modeling. So we make sure that this general equilibrium model replicates reality in a way that is acceptable to us. And once we are sure that our general equilibrium model is accurate in describing how people make residential and school choices, how schools operate, how school quality comes into being, and so forth, we can use the model to say, okay, what would happen if a universal voucher program were implemented? What would happen if a voucher targeting certain kids or kids living in a particular district happen, and so forth? That is the gist of the machinery that is applied in this paper. Now, can that be useful to people interested in school reform? The answer is yes, because of the complexity of this problem. As I mentioned before, any large-scale voucher program would have implications on several markets. And so being able to model those markets will definitely help us understand the many trade-offs and the very complex effects that these different programs would have. Like most policies, vouchers are not neutral. And that is to say, some people are going to benefit from them and some people are going to lose. The question is, how can we target the gains towards those that need them the most, and how can we avoid losses? Well, that's exactly what this kind of model allows us to answer by having the full spectrum of the effects that would take place if these types of programs were implemented. The short answer is, I think that a combination is probably the best approach to education reform. But I do want to say something else. So to have a well-functioning democracy, a government needs a literate population. And so it is in the government's interest to make sure that the population has access to education. That does not mean, however, that the government should be engaged in providing education. The government should make sure that people have access to it, but the government should not necessarily be providing that education. And so currently, about 90% of the elementary and high school students in the United States attend public schools. So we have a quasi-monopoly in the public education system. So what can we do? Well, when we have a monopoly, one thing we can do is we can regulate it, we can monitor it, and that's, in some sense, what the accountability policies, such as No Child Left Behind, attempts to do. On the other hand, we might as well say, well, monopolies generate a number of distortions. The most important being, people don't have choices. Again, let's remember that the government's job is to make sure that people have access to education, not necessarily to provide it. And one way to provide access is to provide private school vouchers. So there is a sense in which accountability and choice are substitutes. We either regulate the monopoly because we want to provide public education, or we let the market establish its discipline by providing access to education through vouchers. There's no need why we need to have an either-or. These two policies could definitely coexist. And they might actually strengthen each other if they coexist. So vouchers have been a very controversial policy since its inception, I would say, in the 50s by Milton Friedman. I think that the reason we don't see more voucher programs is that the political debate is not really focusing on the complexity and the multiplicity of effects that a large-scale program would actually have. As I mentioned before, there is no such thing as a neutral economic policy. Vouchers would benefit some people and hurt others. But there are ways of minimizing the losses for the losers and maximizing the gains for the gainers. And that's exactly where research can help us. So one reason we probably don't see more voucher programs is because we have not been fully open to engaging this intellectual debate to actually understand how these programs would work. My research, much as the research of other people who investigate large-scale voucher programs, tell a number of important lessons. So one of them is it's important to ensure access to as many types of private schools as possible. It's also important to, if we are interested in maximizing school choices for as many households as possible, then let's have a universal voucher program. If we are specifically concerned about the educational achievement of the low-income population, then let's target the vouchers for the low-income population. If we are interested, on the other hand, in bringing suburbanites back into the city, then let's provide a voucher that is targeted to those who reside in the city, because then residence in the city will be a requirement for people to access a voucher, and that might bring people back into the city. So these are conclusions that come from this research and that can definitely help us, provided we know what exactly we are trying to accomplish with the different programs. Low-income families are the families who have no school choice. Middle and high-income families can choose among public school districts, and then they can also choose among private schools. In other words, they have the means, the effective means to exercise choice. Low-income families do not have that. And so anything that provides them, either with means to exercise their choice or with monitoring for the public school systems that they're currently attending, will be good. So along those lines, a voucher program targeted to the low-income population is definitely something that is very desirable, provided that, on the one hand, the dollar amount of the voucher is high enough, because these families have to be able to cover the tuition, and they might not be able to do it on their own, and they might not be able to supplement the voucher if the voucher is too low, and also provided that all private schools are allowed to participate in the program. If only non-sectarian private schools, for instance, are allowed to participate for, say, legal reasons, then we won't have as many choices as we might want. And in fact, Catholic schools, which have a track record of doing very well with urban minorities, would not be able to participate in the voucher program. In other words, we would never accomplish as much with this low-income population as we might otherwise.